All right, it looks like we are live. How do I sound, guys? What is up, comrades? I haven't really been uploading a lot lately on my channel, but I do have quite a bit in the works. I know I keep saying that, but I am working on quite a bit of content right now. I just don't have it materialized in the shape of actual scripted, recorded content. Some of what I am going to be recording here today is going to be featured in my next video because mainly just to save time. Today, I want to talk about a variety of subjects, which I'm at right here. And we'll go over there as we go. So, originally, I was supposed to be debating Hogan again. We were going to have a second debate slash discussion, but what ended up happening is I guess he had a change of heart at the very last minute. And what ended up happening is he no longer felt competent or confident in the position that he set about defending. Basically, originally he was going to defend the position that he believed the USSR to be state capitalist and not actually socialist. We were going to have an extensive economic discussion, but since he no longer feels confident in that position and now he's very much on the fence on the topic, he basically dropped out. He dropped out because he can't defend his position, basically. So he's not going to stand up and argue for a position which he does not believe he is capable of defending or that he really even believes anymore. So we've been feuding quite a bit. And not to make the stream all about that, but I do briefly want to mention it. We were feuding for a bit. We had a debate a few weeks ago, which we were supposed to have the exact same discussion. But what ended up happening is I went to Sunday's channel and I made the mistake of really just assuming that he was actually going to argue in good faith and be honest. I mean, the entire debate, he was being an ass. And I really should have cracked down on it and really just stood up for myself. That was really my biggest mistake, was really just letting him interrupt me, get away with, you know, framing the entire discussion. But he ended up framing it in a very loaded way and deviating away from the original debate topic, which was always economic. And for about 45 minutes, we have the back and forth where we're just talking about a variety of subjects from purges to political repression to whether or not it's compatible with the vision of Marx and Engels. And basically, every time I would try to like get him to defend a point or position, he would basically move away from it. And because like he would try to say that workers didn't own the means of production, I provide evidence that they did, and he basically dismissed it and he moved on to a different topic so that he wouldn't have to address it. And then I moved on to, or he moved on to cherry picking this quote by Marx and Engels, like something about DOTP. I don't even remember the quote, but basically, it ended up not proving his position. I tried to argue that political repression is necessary and compatible, that you got to keep reactionaries out of power. And he was trying to make the case that, do you really think it was a DOTP because certain sections of the working class were repressed as well? Certain sections of workers and certain socialists and so on, like anarchists and Trotskyists. And in the end, I'm like, yeah, it totally is, because just because somebody agrees with socialism in principle doesn't make them an ally. Well, needless to say, the debate was a shit show. I don't really think Sunday did a good job moderating that, just because he was pretty rude. He interrupted me a lot, dismissed a lot of points, and he wouldn't really defend any positions. He didn't really back his shit up. So, for all intents and purposes, that debate was over the second we moved away from the original question, which was economic mode. And so, as a result, I got very frustrated and got very angry with him because I went into that thinking he was actually going to be like intellectually honest, but really he just went on to it treating it like it was WWE, like it was a wrestling sports match. So what I ended up doing was telling him, let's debate again. And we were going to do it today. We got a moderator and everything, but over the last week, he's been 180ing pretty hard on a lot of his initial takes. Like, I remember last year he was making his videos railing against authoritarianism, and now he's just recently made a video talking about why authoritarianism is a meme and liberal propaganda. Like, whoop, totally 180'd. And also, he's starting to turn around and walk back on his original position that like all these countries were just not true socialists, and he's become a lot more sympathetic. Like, we had a one-on-one conversation, and so yeah, he's become a lot more sympathetic, and now he's starting to recognize that like there's not really a lot of value in doing these critiques. And I sit there and I explain to him, there's nothing wrong with critiquing these countries. The problem is that people critique these countries from a position of ignorance. Like, it's one thing if you're going to criticize North Korea or Russia, you know. It's another thing if you're going to levy those criticisms while having an extremely surface level understanding of what actually went down. Like, when those criticisms are based on right wing propaganda and right wing memes and talking points, very shallow surface level understanding of what actually happened, then a lot of those critiques are not going to end up being valid, and they're not going to be useful. And functionally, he even agreed with me here, functionally in the end you're just being a tool of the ruling class because you're just regurgitating right wing propaganda. And I explained to him that once you can debunk that propaganda and show that the right-wing lies are indeed right-wing lies, then socialism becomes a much more exponentially easier sell, because people now see that it did work and it actually improved people's lives. So I was going to have him on. I was thinking about it, but I think I just want to do this presentation. I might have him on later. But all in all, he's backing off a lot of his original takes and positions. I mean, frankly, the only real issue I ever had with him was that he was just basically an anti-communist, and he was basically pretty committed to the ignorance and arrogance of his initial position. And that's the whole reason why I was so initially like hostile towards him in the first place, because someone coming along who they think they know, they think they're so well educated and they think they've got it figured out. They when really they don't. It's like the epitome of Dunning-Kruger, and it was just very frustrating. But regardless, he ended up basically saying sorry in private, and he ended up reconciling these issues. And now he's actually privated like a lot of his original videos, because he doesn't really hold those stances anymore. So, needless to say, he's changing his ways, and the issue is that he's kind of 180'd in the past, because apparently he was like pro cybernetic socialism at one point as well, and he was actually like down the ML pipeline at one point as well. But then he just goes like full anarcho liberal, and now he's turning back around again and coming back to being sympathetic to ML, and that's great and all. But like, this is a person who's terminated their own channel like twice now, who's changed their positions, flipped on these positions in the past. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with changing your mind, all right? In fact, I applaud that. I applaud anybody who's able to come along and realize that what they said were wrong, and what they were, that they weren't as correct as they thought they were, and starting to think more rationally, actually starting to think like Marxists rather than just like moralizing anarcho-liberals. So I told him that he has a place in my Discord, he has a place in my space, but only as long as he is willing to improve himself and put the work in to read the literature, learn and self-improve, and actually like develop like a consistent, principled line. And with that being said, I'm pretty much done with the Hogan arc. We've buried the hatchet. We're on, I'd say, relatively neutral terms now. Today, I'm just here to talk about the economy of the USSR and proving, according to the Marxist literature itself, that they were without a doubt socialist. So I'm probably going to feature a timestamp at around the 10-minute mark. And yeah, we'll just go from there. So anywho, let me go ahead, look at some comments. So for anarchists and other communists, I would say wait and see if they succeed. So like not invade free territories. Yeah. So when am I going to change my ways? And when are you going to change your ways? Russia is fascist under Putin. Bro, the second Russia invaded Ukraine, I did some substantial self-reflecting, and I actually did walk back on my initial support for Russia, mainly because I didn't think they were going to invade, and I didn't really even know they were imperialist as a power. But anyways, I'm not here to talk about the modern Russian Federation. I'm here to talk about the economy of the Soviet Union and to prove that without a shadow of a doubt, it was socialist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a tab, this tab right here. Here's what we got. And we can go over the exact quotations and definitions later on. But for now, let's go ahead and define our terms. Let's go ahead and define what socialism is, all right? According to the Marxian definition. So, socialism is the low stage of communism, which is trying to move towards communism. You know, it's defined by a number of things: worker ownership of the means of production, a rationally planned economy, which is centralized, in which all industry has been centralized and monopolized into the hands of the state. Goods produced as use values, dictatorship of the proletariat, and key difference here: elements of capitalism will still exist as it progresses further onto communism. And we'll come back to that last point here momentarily. So let me just go ahead and go through these real quick. So starting with feudalism. So feudalism is like capitalism. Feudalism has money, markets, and private property. These are things which have existed for thousands upon thousands of years. They predate feudalism, they predate capitalism. In fact, Engels himself acknowledges this much in his supplement to Capital Volume 2. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up note document. Here we go, relevant works cited. And I'm going to share a different document at the same time. So let me go ahead and pull this up. There's the Engels quote. So we'll just share the whole screen for now. All right, cool. So in Engels' own words, the Marxian law of value holds generally as far as economic laws are valid at all for the whole period of simple commodity production. That is, up to the time when the latter suffers a modification through the appearance of the capitalist form of production. Up to that time, prices gravitate towards the values fixed according to the Marxian law of value and oscillate around those values. So that the more fully simple commodity production develops, the more the average prices over long periods, uninterrupted by external violent disturbances, coincide with values within a negligible margin. Thus, the Marxian law of value has general economic validity for a period lasting from the beginning of the exchange, which transforms products into commodities, down to the 15th century of the present era. But the exchange of commodities dates back from a time before all written history, which in Egypt goes back to 2500 BC, perhaps 5000 BC. So there you have it. Engels, supplement to Capital Volume 3. The point is, commodity production goes back thousands of years. So too do money and markets. They have existed since quite literally the dawn of human civilization. And to define capitalism by money, markets, trade, commodity production would basically be to literally say capitalism has existed for thousands upon thousands of years, which it has not. Capitalism has really only existed since like the 1700s. I mean, you have proto-capitalist relations emerging during the 15 and 1600s as well, but the capitalist mode of production didn't officially become the dominance mode of production until the industrial era. Before that, you had mercantilism, in which you had the journeymen, the guilds, the merchants, the journeymen, basically, like the guilds, the guild master and journeyman. So you had the kernels of capitalism forming, but capitalism didn't really truly take off till the industrial era. So basically, private property with relations based on land. So you have the baron and the clergy, which are not mutually exclusive. You could have a baron who is also the clergy and vice versa, and which was commonly the case within peasant societies. The baron, the ruling elite, the aristocrats are by right rule because they're blue blooded. They preordained by God to rule. They have a legal claim to the land based on their hereditary bloodline. So it's a dictatorship of the monarchy, and it's rent-based surplus extraction. So under feudalism, the peasantry, they labor for themselves, but they also pay taxes and pay tribute to the baron. This can come in the form of, shillings, just cold hard cash. This can be, producing goods for the baron, like the cobbler might make some shoes, the tailor makes some clothes, the smithy might make some weapons and armor. You have to pay tribute. You have to pay rent. This could come in the form of you spending some time laboring on your own land, and then other parts of the week or sects of the year laboring on the baron's land. So you would be, working on the baron's land for, like, say, 3 or 4 months out of the year, and then you're off the rest of the year. Something like that. So in that regard, the barons are, we're going to add another point here. Under feudalism, barons are the exploiters, and the peasantry are the producers. Peasants, with the advent of agricultural era, people no longer need to forage for food. We can now produce mass abundance and surpluses of food, allowing for the division of labor to form. Now everyone doesn't need to be a skilled generalist in order to survive. People can specialize in various branches of labor and production. And so the whole idea that the peasantry were just ignorant is largely a meme. The peasantry were actually quite intelligent when it came to the things they needed to be smart at. Like, if you're the descendant of generation after generation of cobbler or a blacksmith, chances are you're going to have those honed crafts and expertise in your specific trade. And so the peasants labor for themselves. They own their own miniature means of production, so to speak. And from there, they produce commodities, both for personal consumption. They produce some for personal consumption, like the cobbler making his own shoes. But the vast majority of it, they produce so they can bring it to local markets for exchange. So it's very much a CMC relationship. So CMC. What the peasants will do, that cobbler will take his commodity that he's produced from his own hands, the fruits of his own inalienable labor. He'll exchange that for money, which he'll use to buy another commodity. The circuit starts with a commodity, ends with another commodity. This is what the peasants do. Merchants will do the opposite. Merchants get wealthy by starting with the money and through speculation. MCM bar. I'm pointing this out because this will be important later. But yeah, the merchants will purchase those commodities, not so that they can buy other commodities, but so that they can flip it for more money. The difference is that this starts with a commodity and ends with something of similar value. So the peasant is spending money to survive, while the merchant is spending money to make more money. And but because legal equality isn't a thing yet, you could end up with situations where the merchants could be 5 to 10 times wealthier than the local baron and the lord of the land, but they would still be below them on the social hierarchy, and they would still be subject to the baron, no matter how wealthy the merchant may be. All right, so let's talk about the industrial era. Coinciding with the industrial era, capitalism went from being like this proto project that was sort of emerging in the form of these guilds to being like the dominant mode of production, basically completely replacing and usurping feudalism. You have the enclosure of the commons, you have the liquidation of the baron's land, you have all the peasantry getting chased off the land, people being crowded and crammed into cities. With the advent of the industrial age, the small-time producers, the peasants, the merchants, the guildsmen, the small business owner cannot compete with this new mode of production, because small business folk are not going to be able to compete with a factory employing hundreds of people, which can produce thousands upon thousands of goods per day. Like the cobbler can only produce a few good pairs of shoes per day, But the industrial capitalist can produce thousands of shoes per day, way cheaper of the same quality. They ain't going to be able to compete with that. So as a result, capitalism comes along and all the peasants get proletarianized. They get de-skilled and they lose out on their businesses, their crafts, because they can't compete. So they have nothing left to sell. So the peasantry are replaced with the proletariat. The proletariat, whom have nothing but their labor power to sell, they bring their labor power to the market and they exchange that for a paltry wage. So coming back to here, means of production are private property of the capitalists, the dictatorship of capital, bourgeois democracy, or just flat out dictatorships. Capitalism can either be democratic or dictatorial. But anywho, here's the difference. So capitalists are both the producers and the exploiters in capitalism. So the capitalists are both the producers and the exploiters. What? What do you mean that they're the producers? I thought it was the workers who produced all of the goods. It's the workers who drive the trucks, pull the levers, operate the machines, and work in retail, right? So how is it that the capitalist is the producer? The reason why is because the workers are trading their labor power, not the fruits of their labor, but the labor power. Once they've exchanged that labor power or that labor time for the wage, that labor time is now the capitalist's property, just like all the means of production. They own the factories, the farms, the land, the machinery, and they also own the workers while they're on the job site operating all those means of production on their behalf. So they own it. So the surplus extraction is hidden by the contract of wage labor, basically. So here's what happens. So worker, it's a similar relationship. In fact, we'll just copy and paste this right here. So for the worker, it looks like this. The worker trades the only commodity he has, his fleeting time on this planet, which he'll never get back, in exchange for wage, money, hourly labor time payments, from which he will trade another commodity, whom are produced overwhelmingly by the capitalists. Capitalists, on the other hand, start with the money. They purchase the commodity, which in this case isn't just the labor power of the workers, but also the means of production itself, like the factories and tools, which the workers operate and run. And then they make more money. This right here, the additional money they get from the sale of the goods that are produced by their private firm on the market, is where the surplus value originates, because the workers are no longer being paid for the fruits of their labor. They're not selling the fruits of their labor or the product of their labor. They're selling their labor power. And this is where alienation comes from, because people no longer own their own labor. They are now alienated from that labor, which is how we get capitalist alienation. So that's a different subject. Capitalists, they own the labor power, they own the means of production, and the money that they make, which is well and above beyond the wage payments, this is the surplus value. It's hidden by the contract of wage labor. Capitalists make their money and get rich by basically paying the workers less than what the value of the labor power they actually generates is worth, basically. So while under feudalism, there's direct rent extraction, under capitalism, there is surplus value extraction by the capitalist, basically paying the workers less. That's pretty much how it works. That's the simplest way to put it. Capitalist doesn't appropriate anything from the workers, he just rips them off. So, moving on. Again, capitalists in this way are both the producers and exploiters, since they own the labor power and the machines and the means of production. And this is where we get into generalized commodity production. So, this is how capitalism is defined. Money, markets, trade, law of value, commodity production, all predate capitalism. And they are not endemic to capitalism. None of this shit is inherently a part of capitalism, or inherently capitalism. They're all important parts of capitalism, but they are not what capitalism is. So this is the difference. Generalized commodity production is when commodity production is the main form of production in society. It's when pretty much everything that is produced in pursuit of exchange value. And with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and economics of scale, with the ever advancing innovation of industry, and with more and more workers being pulled in, as more and more small businesses get thrown out of business, and increasingly the workers become proletarianized, the class divide widens. As this process goes on, they search for more and more markets to exploit, new commodities to sell, new things to turn into private services, and so on. It's the reason why there's no public transit or national health care plan in the United States. These things are private services. Why? Because it's profitable. Everything that happens is based off of profitability, the surplus value that can be extracted. And it's moving more and more towards the direction of commodifying, turning things into markets, and basically entrenching itself deeper and deeper into the earth. Everything is for sale and nothing is sacred. Unlike feudalism, where you actually had a sense of the commons. There was a sense of commons in feudalism, you know? Like you knew the people that lived down the street. You knew what they made, you knew what they produced, and sometimes people would give things to one another. Sometimes people would, mark shit down for one another. Oh, I'm not really gaining anything by selling you these shoes for this price, but you're my next door neighbor, you're my buddy. And so under capitalism, when you go to the grocery store, you don't meet the person that grows and produces the food. The individual relationship in that regard is done. You don't know the workers, you don't know the countless people that are collaborating and participating on the other side of this complex process by which to get you the goods and services that you purchase on a daily basis. And so it's a very, very detached, cold, alienated system in this regard. So that's the main difference, generalized commodity production. Labor is an increasingly socialized endeavor on part of society. All goods are produced in pursuit of increasing amounts of exchange value, increasing amounts of profits. And as capitalism goes on, firms in competition are incentivized to outcompete one another as to produce more and more with less and less, increase the rate of exploitation so they can undercut their competitors. And this is what drives economic growth. Capitalism is a system that is very centered around economic growth. We did not have that before. We did not see, green line go up, red line go up until this. This is the era of line go up. That's capitalism. So capitalism brought forth the industrial era. It brought forth economies of scale, but it also brought forth something that we didn't see in previous eras. While crises certainly happened in feudalism, they did not happen because they were inherent or endemic to the feudal system. Crises occurred because of something external, usually. Meanwhile, the crises in capitalism are inherent to it, as in business cycles. There are periods where in the reckless pursuit of goods for exchange value, the market gets oversaturated over and over again. And in these periods where the market gets saturated or when new profitable opportunities dry up, capitalists cease investing and they fire their workers, they downsize, they liquidate, and the economy enters recession. And that's why we have these ups and downs, ups and downs. It's consistently up, but that's why the boom-bust cycle is what it is. The boom-bust cycle was not a thing before capitalism. And every time these booms and busts occur, wealth gets consolidated, the working class continues to get squeezed, and the crises get worse and worse and worse, and class antagonisms sharpen, the contradictions become increasingly obvious, and this is where Marx and Engels came in with the theory of socialism and communism. Basically, the rationale for a new society becomes obvious, increasingly obvious over time, as life basically becomes more miserable and intolerable for the working masses. So this brings us to socialism. Workers rise up and they overthrow the capitalists, they do socialism. So socialism. Means of production are common property of the workers. Workers to some degree become worker owners. This means they own and control the means of production. And then it operates within the context of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which protects against reactionary and capitalist ego. If the state and the political system is designed to accommodate the needs of the capitalists under the dictatorship of capital and the barons under feudalism, then the dictatorship of proletariat exists to accommodate and protect the needs of the working class, representing the majority, and through the subjugation of the minority. So, surplus extraction is based on what is socially beneficial, drawn up according to a common plan. There is a limited degree of commodity production, distribution according to work, moving towards need over time with the law of value being subjugated, planned economy with a limited degree of local and regional market economics, and it coincides with the later industrial era, advanced scientific and information age, and so on. So there are a lot of caveats here. This is just a very basic rundown of the theory. But the whole idea is that you have the low stage of communism, which is socialism, like once the workers do manage to seize power. And I'm going to bring up some things right now. Principles of Communism by Engels, point 17. Go to point 17. Will it be possible for private property to abolish in one stroke? Now, Dangists and revisionists will try to appropriate this quote to make their point for their revisionism or Dangism. But Engels says this: no more than the existing forces of production can at one stroke be multiplied to the extent necessary for the creation of a communal society. In all probability, the proletarian revolution will transform existing society gradually and will be able to abolish private property only when the means of production are available in sufficient quantity, I mean. So there's a degree of centralization and consolidation of the productive forces that are necessary for this project to happen. Capitalism on its own organically moves towards this centralization through competition, and just because centralization is objectively more efficient. There's a reason why over time, as capitalism ages and advances, the more evolved and advanced the capitalist mode of production becomes, the more aged that the system becomes, the more its mode of production begins to resemble that of socialism due to the sheer degree that labor has become socialized and production has become centralized, and because of the degree to which how easy it is basically to do what we're doing now, where we throw out half the food that we do, despite the fact that most people are going hungry and struggling to pay for their groceries. So we could clearly distribute according to need. We just don't because it's not profitable. So that's just an example of what I'm talking about. But socialism, the whole point is to move towards this natural organic trend towards consolidation and monopolization and to transform it into public property. Instead of breaking up the big businesses so that you can prolong the lifespan of the system, you instead embrace the centralization and retool it for the public good. So, but with that being said, that doesn't mean that, money, markets, commodity production, and production for exchange value completely go away in the low stages of socialism. They still exist to a degree, and they will for some time. And what I'm referring to is like small business owners. Like small business owners would be an example of that, self-employed workers, the petty bourgeoisie. They could still exist in socialism to some extent. They aren't really what I'm talking about when I'm referring to the exploiters. That would be the capitalist. There's a big difference between, having a little mom and pop shop where you employ your kids, a few kids under you, to work under you. Big difference between doing that on a local market and owning a big business with factories all across the planet, employing thousands of wage laborers beneath you. Pretty colossal line between the two. So that's what gets expropriated. That's what becomes common property. So let's talk about this circuit, CMC. So under capitalism, this is the main circuit. Under socialism, this is the main circuit. So in the lower stages of the project, commodity production can still exist. So this is the meme that I'm trying to debunk here. Commodity production can still exist. So workers go from trading their labor power to now owning the fruits of their labor. The means of production and their labor power and the fruits of the labor are now the common property of the worker owners. They got this commodity. Oh, shit. My bad. And they go and they exchange that for a labor time payment, which they use to purchase other commodities. So what we have here is a CMC circuit, and it's on the same societal scale, with production moving more and more towards producing more and more goods, more and more commodities over time. Eventually, the goal is to produce more and more with less and less, shortening work weeks over time, eventually to where you're productive enough to distribute according to need. So that's the general idea. And to substantiate my point that commodity production can exist under socialism and will continue to exist under socialism, and that a parallel to it will exist under socialism, I'm going to go through Marx on the Gotha, and I'm also going to go through Marx in Capital. So let me go ahead and find Marx in the Gotha. Marx in the Gotha, where are you? I'll find it eventually, sooner or later. Here it is. What we have to deal with here is communist society, not as it is developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which thus in every aspect, economically, morally, and intellectually, is still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society whose womb it emerges from. Originally, the individual producer receives back from society after deductions have been made exactly what he gives to it. What he has given to it is his individual quantum of labor. For example, the social working day consists of the sum of the individual hours of work. The individual labor time of the individual producer is the part of the social working day contributed to him, his share in it. He receives a certificate from society that he has furnished such and such an amount of labor after deducting his labor for the common funds. And with this certificate, he draws from the social stock of means of consumption as much as the same amount of labor cost. The same amount of labor which he has given to society in one form, he receives back in another. Here, obviously, the same principle prevails as that which regulates the exchange of commodities. You hear that? Obviously, the same principle prevails which regulates the exchange of commodities. As far as this is exchange of equal values, content and form are changed because under the altered circumstances, no one can give anything except the labor, and because on the other hand, nothing can come past to the ownership of the individuals except individual means of consumption. But as far as the distribution of the latter among individual producers is concerned, the same principles prevail as in the exchange of commodity equivalents. A given amount of labor in one form is exchanged in a given amount of labor in another. Hence, equal right is still in principle bourgeois right, although the principle and practice are no longer at loggerheads, while the exchange of equivalents and commodity exchange exists only on average, but not in the individual case. So, another quote, which is important here. The specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of direct producers determines the relationship of ruler and ruled, as it grows directly out from the production itself and in turn reacts upon its determining elements. Upon this, however, is founded the entire formation of the economic community, which grows up out of the production relations themselves, thereby simultaneously its specific political form. It is always the direct relationship of the owners of the conditions of production to the direct producers, a relation always naturally corresponding to a different stage in the development of methods of labor and thereby its social productivity. So, basically what he's saying is the method of surplus extraction is pretty much where everything else emerges from, hence why I say socialism is an economic mode. So, here's another really good quote. Marx talks about it directly right here. Again, a parallel of commodity production will exist under socialism. On the basis of socialized production, the scale must be ascertained of which those operations which withdraw labor power and means of production for a long time without supplying any products as a useful effect in the interim can be carried out without injuring branches of production which is not only withdraw labor power and means of production continually or several times a year, but also supply means of subsistence and of production. Under socialized as well as capitalist production, the laborers in branches of business with shorter working periods will, as before, withdraw products only for a short time without giving any products in return, while branches of business with long working periods continuously withdraw products for a longer time before they return anything. This circumstance then arises from the material character of the particular labor process, not from its social form. In the case of socialized production, the money capital is eliminated. Society distributes labor power as a means of production to the different branches of production. The producers may, for all it matters, receive paper vouchers entailing them to withdraw from social supplies of consumer goods a quantity corresponding to their labor time. These vouchers are not money, they do not circulate. Now, funny thing is, people will point to that last point and try to say that there was money in the USSR or money in these countries, therefore they weren't socialist because they weren't using labor vouchers. But if they're functionally distributed in the same way that vouchers are, and I mean, there is circulation, but if it all goes back to the Gosbank, and money is playing a very secondary subjugated role, as in it doesn't really matter how much money you have, you can't save up enough to buy a factory, then I would go on to say that it isn't really money in the traditional sense. And again, back to my point, elements of capitalism will still exist under socialism. So, like, I don't think vouchers are like the common denominator that, oh, they're therefore not socialist, especially if they are more of a symbolic thing and more of a secondary thing than they are a real something meaningful. So this is the quote I meant to read. So let us now picture ourselves, by way of change, a community of free individuals carrying on their work with the means of production in common, in which the labor power of all different individuals is consciously applied as the combined labor power of the community. All the characteristics of Robinson's labor are here repeated, but with this difference that they are social instead of individual. Everything produced by him was exclusively the result of his own personal labor, and therefore supply an object of use for himself. The total product of our community is a social product. One portion serves as fresh means of production and remains social, but another portion is consumed by the members as means of subsistence. A distribution of this portion amongst them is consequentially necessary. The mode of this distribution will vary with the productive organization of the community. The mode of this distribution will vary with the productive organization of the community and the degree of historical development attained by the producers. We will assume, but merely for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. Labor time would, in that case, play a double part. It is the apportionments in accordance with a definitive social plan maintains the proper portions between the different kinds of work to be done and the various wants of the commodity. On the other hand, it also serves as a measure of the portion of the common labor borne by each individual, and of this share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. The social relations of the individual producers, which regard both to their labor and to its products, are in this case perfectly simple and intelligible, and that with regard not only to production but also to distribution. So, again, a parallel to commodity production will continue to exist under socialism, and the abolition and the complete removal of commodity production will really only be possible when we are industrially and scientifically productive enough as a civilization to where we can distribute according to need. We aren't at that stage yet. And as long as we are not at that stage, some degree, on some level, commodity production will have to be preserved. Now, that's not to say we couldn't achieve a very high stage of socialism given our productive forces and our technical know-how today. We could definitely take things substantially further than the Soviets did back in their time. But given the time and the circumstances the Soviets found themselves in, they still managed to achieve a very low stage of communism. And so with the collectivization of agriculture, the centralization of their production, they were able to move and implement and integrate exactly what I'm talking about. And what we're talking about here is socialist commodity production. Socialist commodity production. So how is this different from generalized? Well, it's being exchanged, and while profits do exist, they're a secondary lever and not the primary dictating decision of economic activity. There were loads of industries in the USSR, from the heavy industry to the sciences, the arts, cultural centers, movie theaters, variety of other branches of enterprises that, were either not that profitable or were operating on a loss, that the Soviets kept solvent. The state kept them solvent. There was no bankruptcy. They ran them at deficits to the public good. On the other hand, on the flip side, you had their light industry, which were highly profitable. What did they do? They took the profits and the turnover from their light industry and they used it to subsidize and keep solvent all of their heavy industry and the non profitable but socially beneficial sectors of the economy. So, in practice, that's what they ended up doing. And in the process of doing this, as well as drafting 5-year plans, they eliminated business cycles, they eliminated unemployment, they achieved, high degree of income inequality. I believe Albert Zizmansky's statistic is that the worst income gap was like a 10-to-1 ratio. And mind you, the people getting paid the most were like famous movie producers, famous authors, and like actors. They weren't even like government bureaucrats and officials. So if you were like a high skill worker that was in demand, or you were like a famous author or movie producer, you were going to get paid upwards to roughly 10 times more on average than, collective farm workers, agricultural workers, because by even into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was still a significant gap between countryside and cities, but it was a gap that was progressively getting better and better over time, as income inequality actually progressively got flatter over the course of the project. This is the way in which it was socialist. There was worker ownership in the Soviet Union, and there wasn't a rule. There wasn't a capitalist class. There wasn't a stock market. There weren't landlords. They didn't have, an economy that was driven by the law of value. Even in the post-Stalin USSR, during the revisionist Soviet Union, there's a case to be made that they were on a trajectory path towards restoring capitalism. There's not a case to be made, or not a reasonable case to be made, that they were state capitalist by the 50s or 60s and so on. I don't really think there's a good case to be made that that was the case. But anyways, so that's pretty much the way in which their economy was socialist. In regards to, I think that's good for now. Let's go ahead and talk about some common leftist critiques. Let's formulate some common leftist critiques. So, democracy, bureaucracy, and dictatorship. Yeah, we can call it that. Socialism in one country. Not commodity production. We already debunked that. So we debunked the commodity production pretty thoroughly. We also debunked the notion that, actually, I'm going to talk about this a bit, but like I said, elements of capitalism will continue to exist under the lower stages of socialism. In the higher stages, then we can have a conversation about distributing according to need. But hell, even in the Soviets era, they were getting closer to doing that. They decommodified lots and lots of stuff that is usually commodified. And I'm not even talking about like the SOCDEM gibs, like healthcare, education, and housing, but like decommodifying like books, decommodifying movies, tickets, cultural events and endeavors. This shit got extremely cheap, if not basically free, by the 1970s. In fact, because of the degree to which goods were heavily subsidized by the government and made incredibly fucking cheap, it actually caused some problems because shelves would get cleared faster than they would get cleared faster than what, supply could meet demand. So you end up with an issue because there was no inflation. It was basically an iron law in Soviet economics that your currency cannot inflate. That was actually a contributing factor to shortages because they didn't really price ration properly. I mean, there were other things that contributed to it as well, but that was a contributor in its own right. So anyways, let's talk about these real quick. So first, what do we got here? So let's start with the democracy, bureaucracy, and dictatorship. Go ahead and move on to this. I'm just going through as many of these as I can debunk. So we'll start with that. But first, bad habit. As I stated earlier, socialism is an economic mode. It's not a method of political organization. So even if all the memes about really existing socialism were true, even if all the memes are true, that people had no freedom, that it was just a top-down dictatorship, that's not compatible with the socialist economic mode. I mean, it is. You can have undemocratic socialism and you can have undemocratic capitalism. Saudi Arabia is an example of undemocratic capitalism. You have a monarchy that's in charge who own a bunch of state property. You have the Russian oligarchy. There are plenty of examples of dictatorships or capitalist dictatorships that are pretty blatantly undemocratic. You can also have democratic capitalism, like the United States of America. I mean, I'm not making the case that, I mean, it is democratic. It's democratic in the sense that only 10% of the population really get what they want. So it's pretty democratic if you're rich. So in our theoretical, hypothetical, undemocratic socialism, how does that work? Well, I'll tell you how it works. You have a bureaucracy that runs the economy. They make all the decisions from the top down, and they administer all the decisions. They take some degree of feedback from below because they have to. And the bureaucrats are running the economy according to a rational plan. They're all socialists. They are all adherents of Marx's work. And the economy itself runs like a socialist economy, but people cannot decide or have any say in the decision-making process individually. So they would basically be worker owners that are not able to exercise the decision-making elements of that ownership. But it would still be technically their property because everything's nationalized. It's all public property. So because it's a planned economy that operates according to a rational plan, which operates towards the public good, you could have an undemocratic socialism in theory. And this is, mind you, buying into the premise that actually existing socialism had no democracy. That premise is bullshit, but I don't need to get too much into it because I don't want this live stream to be too long. But even if you grant the premise true, you can have undemocratic socialism. It's not ideal. It's not certainly what I want. Not what I want at all. Undemocratic socialism is very much doomed to crash and burn because if your system's not democratic, what happens when all the old guard is gone? All the old guard is gone. People don't have a say in who gets in charge. You could end up very easily in a situation where opportunists hijack the levers of power and they just run everything according to the law of value and start enriching themselves off of the coffers of the public good. That's also a possibility. From there, if it's running on the law of value and you have just a clique of bureaucrats that are basically enriching themselves off of wage labor, and so basically China, an economy like China, if you want to imagine what a truly revisionist or state capitalism, basically what the imagined straw man of what people think the USSR was, is literally modern day China. So if you want an example of that, there's your example of that. Otherwise, even during the revisionist era, there was corruption and opportunism and so on. And it is true that you had the infamous second economy that like politicians and various peoples were playing into. But again, the second economy is not the first economy. If the first economy operates the way I'm saying it does, and you have a second economy that's just a market economy, that's just illegal, that operates underneath it, that market economy is, you could have that capitalist market or that second market economy operating. So basically what I'm saying is these statements are true, and it's not a true dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. So bureaucrats are not capitalists. They do not own the means of production, nor can they enrich themselves off of the wage labor. They can't extract surplus value from wage labor. They can't take heavy industry and socially beneficial enterprises and run them as like light industry or fidget spinner factories because they're more profitable. They can't make those kinds of decisions. They are not functionally they're not functionally capitalists. They're basically uh, professional blue collar workers, like highly skilled blue collar workers and planners that just make decisions about hitting input and output targets based off of a commonly drafted plan. And but the good news is that, as I've said, there was a limited degree of workplace democracy and workers' autonomy within the Soviet project. There was. People had a right to criticize, recall, hire, and fire their managers. Anybody could run for elections for any positions of power and authority. One need not be a member of the party to do so. Like, this shit's all in the Stalin Constitution, people. Like, watch this. They like, I think like a solid 20 years before. Let me go to Marxist Internet Archives. Here we go. So a solid like 20 years before universal suffrage was granted to American workers, the Soviets literally at the onset gave universal suffrage to the entire population. That's not something America did. That's not something capitalist countries do. You know, the oppressed minorities and nationalities had to struggle for that shit. They weren't just given that for free. They had to fight for that. But here in the Soviet Union, elections. Here we go. Level in the event of disagreement, the question of chambers, failing agreement. Here we go. Presidentium of the Supreme Soviet dissolves the Supreme Soviet and comments an article and now orders new elections. Which article? Okay. Elections of deputies are universal. All citizens of the USSR who have reached the age of 18, irrespective of race or nationality, religion, education and residential qualifications, social origin, property status, or past activities, have the right to vote in elections of deputies to be elected, with the exceptions of insane persons and persons who have been convicted by court of law, and those whose sentences include the deprivation of electoral rights. Election of deputies are equal. Each citizen has one vote. All citizens participate in elections on equal footing. Elections are direct. All Soviets and working peoples from rural and city Soviets, yada, yada, yada. You get the idea. They're secret ballots. Candidates for elections are nominated according to electoral areas. So, yeah. Long story short. So, there was a limited degree of democracy in the USSR. And just to be frank with you guys, yeah, ideally, we should have the freedom to criticize and recall the presidents, but I'd rather have the ability to recall and criticize my boss than the president because one of these people has much more direct influence over my daily life than the other. But anyways, next point. So, as an addendum to that last point, the reason why the political nature of a lot of these socialist countries seem very repressive and top down on the surface is because of the conditions in which they were operating. It's kind of hard to develop the perfect workers' democracy when, in the conditions of encirclements and of siege. Like, ideally, like in Marx and Engels' original theorems, the workers were supposed to have a much more direct worker-owner relationship. It was supposed to head in a more decentral direction organically over time. Like the state was supposed to wither away after the revolution. But in the advent of imperialism, you can't really do that. So instead, the state and bureaucratization and centralization and the top-down siege psychology, siege nature is what ended up emerging because they were all not advanced capitalist countries that had the revolutions, but semi-feudal, semi-colonial, backwards, undeveloped countries that did it. It wasn't the advanced countries. In fact, on the contrary, workers in the advanced countries got bribed with the spoils of colonialism and imperialist plunder into basically staying complicit with the system. So it was the second and third world that had the revolutions, and when they did, they got encircled and besieged, like the history of the Cold War. So the political process emerged as a byproduct in the wake of these conditions of siege. But regardless, socialism's an economic mode, so the political structure emerges according to the material economic base and the external material conditions. I'm sure if imperialism wasn't a thing, and I'm sure if, we lived in a world absence of imperialism, we probably could have something resembling that. We probably could have, this very streamlined, direct democratic worker ownership as envisioned by a lot of anarchists, like this upheld ideal. Like, guys, I would love for that to be the case, like where, it's all decentral and we all just work together and communally come together and we're able to make these decisions and in a very streamlined, direct process. I want that. Like, I want stateless, classless, moneyless society. But what I care more about is survival. Once you've secured the survival question and you're able to survive the imperialist onslaught, then you can have a question about the withering away of the state. Even if it's true that all existing socialism was undemocratic, I would rather have an undemocratic socialism that's able to survive the pressures from the outside world than the idealized model that gets implemented and put into place, but because it's not centralized or consolidated, because it's not into a siege like formation, it just gets crushed and destroyed. I mean, because here's the thing, man. You secure your survival under that undemocratic socialism. Decades down the line, as it's entrenched itself and as it's been able to further secure its survival, you can work within that system and reform it to make it more like the ideal. You can make it more democratic. You can make it more towards the higher stages of socialism. You can take it in that direction. There, even if it's undemocratic, you at the very least, if you're able to survive, you're at the very least able to take things to the next step and have a chance at improving and reforming the system and making it better, which is something the Soviets were progressively moving on to do. Like, lots of reforms, like their economy was constantly changing. Decentral planning to some degree was introduced, and increased autonomy was introduced to some extent. And a lot of the original like political restrictions ended up getting laxed. The issue is in the wake of a lot of the relaxing of those restrictions and the laxing of that, you got to be careful with that, because if you aren't very careful about allowing opposition and so on, shitty people like liberals and CIA agents and fascists can very easily come in and take full advantage of that outlet. And those aren't the kinds of people that you want to have a platform. So I'm not against factionalism. I'm not against, diversity of thought and all this, but I'm an adherent of democratic centralism first. And while I do think outlets for the opposition should be tolerated and allowed, it's got to be done within a very insulated and careful way to which the forces of reaction don't get nobilized. So, yeah. So moving on. Socialism in one country. Move on in this point. So, socialism in one country. This is a point that a lot of ultras will make as well. I'm going to try and find a good quote. Here we go. From Lenin. This is from Lenin Report on Foreign Policy. He says, "I know there are, of course, wisecracks with a high opinion of themselves and even calling themselves socialists who assert that power should not have been taken until the revolution broke out in all countries. They do not realize that in saying this, they are deserting the revolution and going over to the side of the bourgeoisie. To wait until the working classes carry out a revolution on an international scale means that everyone will remain suspended in midair. This is senseless. Everyone knows the difficulties of a revolution. It may begin with brilliant success in one country and then go through agonizing periods, since final victory is only possible on a world scale, and only by the joint efforts of the workers of all countries." So basically what Lenin is saying here is that ideally we should take power in as many countries as humanly possible, but the realistic scenario, what's most likely to happen, is the socialists take power in only one or multiple countries at once, and they form a socialist camp. And they form that camp So once you have that camp of socialist countries, you can either A, capitulate to liberalism and basically do capitalism. You can just abandon the revolution, which is what the implications of a lot of these people who say you can't have socialism in one country is. That's functionally what it is, because the only other alternative that comes to mind is that. And then there's two, build a socialist country, build an ideal model that other countries can model themselves off of, and, provide that shining beacon. And once you've built that model, once you've secured material gains and economic success for yourself, and you've established a socialist economy, then you can go about worrying about spreading socialism wherever and whenever possible and engaging in a protracted period of struggle with the imperialist powers until socialism can eventually emerge dominant and the forces of reaction can meet their final defeat. So, anywho, that's socialism in one country. I mean, that's really it. I pretty much talked about everything here to an extensive degree. And later on, I'm probably going to take segments of this live stream for a future video. But yeah, I think that's about it. I've talked about pretty much everything. So in summary, USSR was socialist, bitches. Cry about it. You don't like it. You don't agree with it. That's fine. If you have your own definition of socialism, you have your own idea about what socialism ought to be, what it ought to look like, you have your own standards, that's wonderful. That's handy dandy. But until you're able to provide an alternative, until, you and your folks are able to take and hold power somewhere, or you're able to properly and adequately address the same questions that they had and answer these same questions and take it as far, if not further, than the Soviets. I mean, right now they provided pretty much the best and most successful path forward. That's not to say they didn't make policy errors. That's not to say they didn't make mistakes. But that's the whole point. This is the way science works. You don't have a scientific theory and you take that theory and you scrap it because the model wasn't able to account for X, Y, Z, or there are shortcomings in the model, and the model doesn't have enough explanative power to fix everything. The whole point is that you update the model, or you create another model which is newer and better that replaces the other model. So, and even then, even when that happens, the previous model usually just gets absorbed into the newer model. So I always like to use the example of Newtonian physics. Einstein's theory of general relativity basically absorbed and ate Newtonian physics and adapted it and made it better. It advanced the scientific method, it advanced the scientific theory. And that's my stance on ML. ML has advanced Marxism. It has advanced scientific socialism. And it's updated it. And it's been seen wide success to the point to where there are still, even after the fall of the communist world, there are still a handful of communist states left. And even if you don't want to identify with ML, that's okay. But you stand a lot to gain by actually reading Marxist literature and learning the thought of these people and learning the thought of these individuals, because you don't know better than they do. You don't know better than the people who did the practice themselves, who lived it and practiced and participated in it. You can only develop and foundationally sow criticism and theory if you have a foundation of knowledge and understanding underlying underneath that theory. Otherwise, you're just spewing nonsense and having an undeserved altitude about yourself, basically. So, to those of you who are of the non-ML position that think you know so much that, oh, Lamau, crazy tankies, I'm going to dunk on you. People of that mindset and position, all I have to say is, like, just grow the fuck up. Like, seriously. People need to grow the fuck up. Like, I'm sure a lot of these people who are so, like, hardcore anti-tanky, I mean, if they just set their ego aside and actually took some time to read about this shit, many of these people would begin to understand. And I think that's what they're afraid of. And many of them, well, they would stop being anti-tanky because now they understand that the true nature of their infantile position. But anyways, let's go ahead and call it there. You guys got questions, comments? I'm going to start reading them. about the rare fish market. That kind of reminds me of poaching. Uh, it should not be tolerated, obviously. If you've got endangered fucking species of animals that are out in the wild and they're in short supply, either start farming those motherfuckers or you outlaw it or both. I think we should just start farming like fish farms. That way, them rare fish ain't so rare. You know what I'm saying, dog? Otherwise, in my world, I would outlaw exotic farming, hunting of exotic game, poaching. This shit would go away. But enforcement of that would largely be left on the people. I think if you go to Africa and you kill a fucking giraffe or a lion, like these people on social media that kill these beautiful, exotic, endangered animals, these rare megafauna that are dying out. I mean, I can sympathize a little more with people who kill them for food, but people who kill them for trophy and for sport deserve to get fucking poached themselves. People who do poaching, who hunt rare endangered animals for sport, deserve to be hunted for fucking sport themselves. That's my attitude. Again, time travel would be so based. I mean, it would. Time travel would be so based because we could use it and criticize the fuck out of Marx so we could have 2020 theory in the 19th to 20th century. Dude, if I had a time machine, I would pay like literally every major Marxist writer and theoretician a visit. I would have to learn some languages first, learn some German and Russian and so on. But after I've learned the languages, go back in time, and I would start with Marx and Engels. I would basically red pill them on third worldism, tell them, first world workers are going to get fucking bribed, and you guys should prioritize your energy and efforts in making revolution happen in the colonized and third world, and getting in touch and connected with them and helping them because capitalism isn't as entrenched, it's not as developed, they're getting exploited. People there are way more likely to revolt. So I would fucking red pill them. I would red pill them on their own colonial Eurocentric world outlook and explain to them why they're wrong, because that's actually pretty substantial fuck up on the part of Marx and Engels. They had very, very Eurocentric, very shallow understanding of colonialism. And it wasn't until the later years of their life when they started to talk about the aristocracy of labor and first world bribery to when they started to realize their error. To Lenin, actually, I don't really know what I would send to Lenin. I would tell him, you're going to be dead pretty fucking soon, and tell him that you're making the right decision putting Stalin in power, and that Trotsky needs to be done away with a lot sooner because he's a nuisance. I'd point out all the troublemakers and people that are going to become issues later on, and I would have these people revoked and replaced. And from there, go pay Stalin a visit. Tell him, yo, bro, collectivization is going to shock the countryside, and it's going to cause a famine. And warn him about the extreme weather, warn him about whatever I can, and tell him that basically warn him about the famine, warn him about the incoming damage and the shock and so on. And I would also let him know the exact date after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, exactly when Poland and Russia was going to go and get invaded. So I'd warn him about the famine, warn him about World War II, and I would also go on to drop off some modern computer era technology, like modern computer parts, computer chips, and red pill him on cybernetics and computational planning, get the ball rolling on that. And then, I'd also warn him that you may want to get rid of Mao. No, I would tell the Soviets during the 50s, you guys may want to get rid of Mao. So there's that. Oh, yeah, get rid of Mao and secure the Sino-Soviet alliance by any means necessary. So what would I tell Mao? I'd probably warn Mao about the famine as well, and Probably try to convince and argue with him to ally back with the Soviets if possible. Probably to no avail. Pay Castro a visit. What would I tell Castro? I'd tell him to fucking modernize. Like, dude, get some more industrial equipment. Modernize Cuba. Don't just be a sugar importer. Like, actually, like, modernize your country. Really, I would do everything in my power to warn all these important historical leaders and figures about who the problem causers are going to be, who the counter-revolutionaries are, drop off some technology that could help them out, drop off some blueprints that could help them out, tell them about their policy errors and provide alternatives, and basically travel the world and do everything in my power to see to it that the Reds win the Cold War. I mean, I basically explained how you would do that. Does the death of Dante Various Kingle affect the future prospects of communism? I don't really know who that is. I'm afraid I don't know who that is. Oh yeah, get rid of Khrushchev. Fuck yeah. Where else? FT should react to Bad Empanada's video and his big brain takes on Stalin. Then why are you going to change your ways? Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, whatever. Yeah, sure. We'll go ahead and do a little reaction. Finish with this. Bad Empanada. Here we go. So, right here. His conclusions. Let's talk about his conclusions. So, here's the thing, guys. I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this, but I agree with pretty much everything right here. I think his analysis is overall very solid. Where I disagree more than anything else is really just his conclusions. And I mean, I can try and dig up some literature to make my case. I don't completely agree with Bad Empanada's conclusions. I like halfway agree, halfway disagree. Like, I think some of his criticisms are valid, but I also think that some of them are misfounded or misinformed as well. But it's not that big of a deal. Bad Empanada is like not really like a hardcore. From what I can tell, he's not exactly president of Stalin's fan club. I mean, neither am I. Like, by no means. But anywho,
a regional food shortage, and which Stalin, anyone even remotely reputable, who's willing to write things that align with that interpretation. Unfortunately, this has all been part of a wider and highly successful campaign in Ukraine to spread the aforementioned double genocide view of history, and thus legitimize the ultranationalist and fascist groups who trace their lineage to Nazi collaborators and Holocaust perpetrators, and to thus...
That's all objective fact, by the way. 100% objective fact. Everything up to here, I agree, he's 100% right on.
Primarily define themselves in opposition to the USSR and today's Russia, because they imagine the two as one, as, well, Asiatic hordes, which of course through some very adept mental gymnastics they themselves are not a part of, despite also being Slavs. For this reason, the research on the matter, which is much more nuanced...
Oh yeah, it takes some hardcore mental gymnastics to be... hardcore mental gymnastics to be a fucking Ukrainian Nazi. You motherfuckers would have been exterminated if Hitler had things his way. Come on, dude.
Than the general public perception would indicate, and which actually leans quite heavily towards the idea that there is just no evidence for any national interpretation of the famine, has largely been ignored outside of its academic bubble. This is made clearer through a comparison with the same famine's effect on Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan actually suffered worse and even longer than Ukraine did. Around 30% of its population...
Thank you. Kazakhstan got hit really hard. They had similar mortality rates as Ukraine. Parts of Russia also got hit really hard, and they also saw pretty high spikes in mortality. So, like, it's kind of a false notion that, like, you know, it was a deliberate genocide, because if they were trying to genocide Ukrainians, then that means they were also trying to genocide Kazakhstan, parts of Russia, parts of Hungary, parts of China, because famine was in China during that time too. So it's just totally unsubstantiated.
Died. And just like Ukraine, there's also a myth in Kazakhstan which frames the famine as a planned genocide of Kazakhs, which is similarly rejected by most modern historical scholarship. But unlike the intentional Holodomor narrative, you've probably never heard of this idea, because there's simply no accompanying political movement spreading it internationally by paying people to write about it or make documentaries or movies about it, holding international events about it, or lobbying other governments to recognize it as such. Nor is the Kazakh government incorrect. It was caused by a failure in agricultural policy.
Oh, here we go.
including 2 million dead in Russia itself, so the national interpretation is just incorrect. It was caused by a failure in agricultural policy exacerbated by natural factors, which led to a poor harvest, which led to a regional food shortage, and which Stalin's government failed to adequately respond to.
This is all 100% true. Failure, shortcoming of agricultural policy mixed with some economic gambling. Like the Soviet government genuinely did fuck up to a pretty severe degree over up to the years leading up to that. He'll explain where I disagree.
Large part because they wanted to hide the famine from the wider USSR and world, hence they undertook most of their relief efforts in secret, which obviously greatly hindered their effectiveness. So they certainly deserve a lot of the blame, but they didn't kill anyone intentionally. The famine was undesired. This means that the famine clearly doesn't meet the common definition of the term genocide, which most people think to involve mass intentional killing of specific groups of people, rather than many accidental deaths among different groups of people. Under a wider definition of genocide, it might qualify, but that would need to be a definition that includes deaths by mismanagement and neglect, and that doesn't need to be targeted at any specific group of people.
Yeah, and that's another valid criticism that you can make. The Soviets did try to hide the famine from the world. Why? I mean, there's a couple reasons. I suspect it's because they just don't want, because the siege psychology, they don't want it to be used as a propaganda tool, or basically to be used to fucking blame or sanction or demonize the Soviets in any way, shape, or form, and they don't want to be dependent on Western aid, as little as possible. At least that's what I suspect. I don't know the reasons why they hid it, but I mean, it is a valid criticism. The Soviet government should have been very transparent and in requesting aid where possible and whenever possible, because they could have certainly saved a lot more lives in doing so.
Which just really kind of defeats the point of the term and would implicate basically every government in the world of genocide. So by the understanding of the vast majority of people and the UN definition of the term, the Holodomor was not genocide. That said, it was still mostly the fault of Stalin's government. Stalin's agricultural policy was disastrous, and his treatment of the peasants was incredibly brutal. To him, they were closer to serfs than comrades in a socialist project. Peasant disobedience to this state of affairs was inevitable and caused by the government itself. And their reaction to that, rather than listening to peasant grievances and changing course, was to brand any dissenter as a kulak, a saboteur, a class enemy. Their narrative was quite literally that the peasants were basically intentionally starving themselves to death to get back at the government, which is obvious.
No. Now we're actually getting into some disagreements. So and I can provide sources for this if you guys would like, but basically, Soviets pitched the Soviet government in 28, 29 pitched collectivization, said they were going to start the drive towards collectivization, and with the drafting of the first 5-year plan, they sent tens of thousands of specialists, volunteers, government workers, war vets, just activists out in the countryside to mobilize the peasantry and to drive and whip them. Well, not whip's the wrong word, but really just to drive the push towards collectivization. And what ended up happening is a good chunk of the peasantry actually voluntarily did it. Collectivization was actually a policy that existed prior to well prior to the Soviets. Collective farming was a thing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but they were and with the wake of Tsarist agricultural reform, they were also a part of that as well. What happened was shit got reprivatized and then they got recollectivized later on, basically. But otherwise, yeah, collective farming was actually not really that new of a policy. It's something that existed a few decades prior to that. And really the Soviets were just bringing it back. So naturally the peasants already had a pretty good grasp of what that was. So many of them voluntarily, of their own volition, and even spontaneously started to form their own collective farms. And they start doing it very rapidly. And when you have all the activists out in the countryside, truth is that party presence was incredibly weak out in the countryside. So they didn't have the means to basically control 100 million people from the top down in a super hyper dictatorial fashion. They didn't really have the mean to do that because out in the countryside, party presence was incredibly weak. So a lot of the rapid collectivization came really just from a spontaneous push from the bottom up. People really downplay and underestimate the degree to which the masses had a very important part to play in the project. And yeah, the shock of rapid collectivization was, in fact, a contributing factor. The shock of rapid collectivization, the lack of proper communications, the disobeyment of the rank and file, like you would have party officials abusing their power and authority, or just ignoring government policy from time to time, or just, ignoring standard procedure. You would have that going on. You did have genuine kulak sabotage. That was indeed a thing. And to act like that didn't have any part to play in the famine is nonsense, considering they were fucking slaughtering cattle, burning crops, and, hoarding grain and to protest the government. And people will talk about how, like, oh, well, they punished people for hoarding grain. Yeah, because there's a fucking famine. And if you've got silos of grain buried out in the backyard during a famine when people are starving, you deserve to be fucking disciplined for that. So, all in all, most of the population consented to it. The total number of people that end up basically getting disciplined, I think there was about 1 million, 1.5 million deportations which took place. Like, those were the people that were deemed kulaks out of a peasant population of about 110 million. 1.5 million people. Basically, kulak families, peasant families, and their children were pretty much deported. And what ended up happening is, because Russia was a broke-ass third world country, many of them starved, got sick, and died out in the regions of the USSR that they got deported to. And in the wake of that happening, many of the children actually were brought back. A lot of the kids were brought back and sent to live with their extended family and relative members. The people were allowed to bring their belongings and so on, but party officials ignored that so that they could, just force them to leave their homes without bringing anything with them, which was actually against standard procedure. So that's part of what I'm talking about. People really downplay and underestimate the degree to which the masses participated and were involved in all of this. People won't make it out like Stalin was this omnipotent dictator that was just in absolute control of absolutely everything. Like that's the model. That's the general narrative. So, I mean, I'm not saying that the Soviet government didn't treat the peasants rather harshly. I mean, there was harsh treatment of the peasants, and the distribution of aid was also uneven. Like, a lot of that food just went into the cities. So that's also a reasonable criticism to make. I would say where I disagree with Bad Empanada is really just in the way he reinforces the whole omnipotent dictator narrative in a sense, and I don't think that's a right way to portray this.
Obviously just absurd. Some Stalinists today still cling to the same excuse for the famine, framing it not just as an important factor, but the most important factor. But there is quite literally not one single serious historian who would agree with that. It's complete.
What are you talking about?
Nonsense. Even
No. Davies and Wheatcroft, Years of Hunger. They even talk about the fucking kulaks. Like, I can't give you a page number right now because it's been a while, but kulak sabotage was a thing. It didn't cause the famine, but it was certainly an ongoing thing that was centered around the famine. Like, people don't realize in the years prior to leading up to the collectivization, under the NEP, there was a rural bourgeoisie, an agrarian bourgeoisie, and that these rural and agrarian capitalists basically were fleecing the Soviet government. And the Soviets were basically forced to purchase grain at market prices for their exports, which, if you're not able to procure grain requisitions below world markets or world market prices, then that defeats the purpose. So, I mean, they had to collectivize people. They had to do this push to collectivize and to centralize and industrialize. I mean, I don't think that the famine was inevitable. I mean, had it happened in a much more slow, controlled, gradual process, and had the Soviet government not hiding it. There are other errors that they made. But basically they put proletarianization, superindustrialization, and the construction of socialism before the needs of the peasantry in the countryside. So it's sad state of affairs, but the Soviet Union was a dictatorship of the proletariat. It was not a dictatorship of the peasantry, the barons, and the merchants and rural bourgeoisie. So I'm not making excuses for any of the wrongdoings or mistakes, and I'm not trying to absolve Stalin of any accountability on his end. There's certainly things that he and his government can be held accountable for, but I just disagree with the framing that it was just a top-down dictatorship, basically.
Even if the famine was not a genocide, it was still a massive failure of policy, and the government reacted with more concern for its self-image than for the people who were dying en masse. This is not at all something unique to Stalin or the USSR. Governments in general love to cover up and downplay events that are inconvenient for them, but it happened nonetheless, and it's impossible for such massive human disaster not to be attributable to the authorities who oversaw it, and especially not the ultimate authority. In this case, Stalin. The fact of the matter is that Stalin heavily deviated from principles formed by Lenin and earlier Bolsheviks regarding the autonomy of peasants and of nationalities, with disastrous effect, demonstrated by this famine along with many other things, such as
hold on, what does he mean by that?
Lysenkoism, the deportation of the Crimean Tatars, and the reversal of Lenin's cultural and language policies, which were designed to foster each Soviet republic's unique identity. Compared to other Soviet leaders, Stalin was uniquely brutal in ways which were not just completely unnecessary for the economic and social development of the USSR, but also just actively detrimental to it. So in no circumstances can his crimes be justified as simply being for the greater good. Stalin was also just not really anything exceptional in global terms either.
Yeah, so he's saying here that Stalin wasn't uniquely evil. In regards to his criticisms, I think that the reversal of those principles, and in regards to the whole autonomy of various independent republics, I think it's a relatively valid criticism. But no matter what, you cannot argue that collectivization was the wrong course of action. You can argue that the ways that they went about it were wrong, because here's the thing, guys. Plenty of countries have fucking collectivized, and the result hasn't been famine. Let's see, Nicaragua, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, Eastern Europe. There's Afghanistan before, Civil War. There are plenty of instances where socialist countries have collectivized and centralized their agriculture within the context of a agrarian peasant society, and the result hasn't been famine. It was the way that they went about it and the mistakes that they made along the way that exasperated the problems. I mean, natural disaster certainly had a hand to play. I mean, and keep in mind, in the grand scheme of things, Russia and China, people will point to these famines, and it is fair to attribute blame to the governments for these famines, but you should also keep in mind that famines have plagued these countries for literal centuries before then. Under the Russian Empire, under feudal China, these countries suffered from cyclical famines from literal centuries. And mind you, net calorie consumption, even during the worst years, was actually higher, if not on par, than it was on a good year during the Russian Empire or the Chinese era. So net calorie consumption, average calorie consumption in Soviet Russia during the famine drops to I believe 1800 during the worst years, before shooting back up into the mid to high 2000s, into the 3000s by 60s and 70s. But if you look before that, under the Russian Empire, it was it oscillated between 1500 and 2200 per year. So even on a good year, it was well below net calorie consumption. So in the grand scheme of things, did they fuck up? Yeah. But through the implementation of socialism, and by virtue of modernizing, superindustrializing, they were basically able to bring an end to the cyclical famines that plagued these countries for centuries. Let's play a little more.
crimes, while real, are very heavily exaggerated. In reality, they were similar to what many Western capitalist leaders have done. The vast majority of those who hyper-focus on Stalin and the USSR have never reckoned with the similar, and honestly mostly worse, crimes of their own countries or of those they support, or even outright deny them. That Stalin is singled out as being uniquely bad is just a propaganda artifact. The sad reality is that he was engaging in the same nation-building practices that other European countries had perfected beforehand, involving widespread political and ethnic repression. But that's exactly why he sucked. The USSR was meant to be better than that. It was meant to offer and represent something that was different to the oppression that had characterized the past. That Stalin's government went and did much of the same anyway is just sad. Some people on the left have problems reconciling this and overcompensate by denying Stalin's crimes or even justifying them. But you don't need to, because they had nothing to do with the economic and political systems of the USSR, and everything to do with he and his government's paranoid attempts to maintain their own power. Are you it?
Yeah. I think that's also another valid point. I would say that I agree. I think some things that they did in regards to the repression in principle were justified. Like, I think when it comes to the very premise of the purges, I think the premise of the purges were justified. What I don't think was justified was the extreme harshness to which many on the opposition and many who were suspected of being alien class elements were treated. I don't think that the deportations were justified at all. There's no fucking justifying that. Fuck that. I think that when it came to a lot of the people within the government, like, there were genuine conspiracies and there was genuine, like, abuses of power and corruption. But, like, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say they were all innocent. I'm very neutral when it comes to the purges. I'm willing to bet it was a mix of the two, but a lot of innocent people got caught in the crossfire of it because of an incredibly paranoid government that was trying to protect itself. Basically, the amalgamation from previous knowledge from previous revolutions and who the counter-revolutionaries were, looking to the Paris Commune, French Revolution, and the trends within their political cliques, which led to the ultimate failures and the outcomes that they did. Combination of that, combination of course, the paranoia, mounting, looming war on end. You're trying to build a socialist project. You're trying to keep everybody on the same page. I feel like the reason why Stalin gets so much flack isn't even because he did it so much as it because he won. I feel like many of the outcomes would have been largely similar, and had they not been similar, the Soviet Union would not have survived the 1940s. Like, if Trotsky had power, the outcomes would have largely been the same. They just would have happened sooner because Trotsky wanted to continue war communism and basically do Napoleon Bonaparte type foreign policy. Trotsky would have been a Bonapartist. Bukharin would have restored capitalism. The czars wouldn't have done anything useful. There were other elements and other components of the government that were more moderate wings. But my point is that many of the outcomes would have largely been the same. I think not all of them would have been the same. Like, I don't think the deportations were inevitable. I think the widespread political repression was really something that was started, but through its own self-fulfilling logic got worse and worse and out of control. Bear in mind, all this took place within the context of a popular socialist country where the pioneering spirit and the revolutionary collective solidarity and will of the people were pretty much in line with the Soviet government. Like the Great Terror, Stalin wasn't managing every aspect of it. He was the guy who started it and he was at the center of it, but there were all these other actors and people outside of him that were doing and engaging in various actions to his knowledge and without his knowledge, with his command, without his command, this and that. He got the ball rolling on it, and then when it got taken way further than his liking, he ultimately was the one who clamped down and put an end to it. So I'm very neutral when it comes to it. But yeah, I would say that the main premise and where I disagree is really just like the degree to which the masses had a hand to play, and the degree to which all these other characters participated in it as well, basically. So I think that's it. I largely agree with Bad Empanada. I don't really think his takes here are particularly bad. I actually think they're really nuanced. Where were we? What do we got here? It's done. The state of potato farming has been heavily affected recently. I know nothing about that. Guys, I didn't come here to talk about all these extra topics, but Quebec, I'll go ahead and look this up. Find your local family runs potato farm. Speds, Canadian potato crop is the tale of East and West. Somebody send me some information. Anybody in the Discord, hook me up because I really don't know. Also, Empanada's conclusion wasn't that far off of Vicky 1999, though it was much better research, IMO. That being said, both are good conclusions. Yeah, I would like to see your sources. I want to learn more about this specific event. It's been used left and right with the current events on Ukraine. Oh man, fucking tell me about it. Yeah. So I'm referring to a few different works when I talk about this. I'm referring to Wheatcroft's Years of Hunger, Robert Thurston's Road to Terror. I'm also referring to J.R. Getty's Origins of the Great Purge, Stalinist Terror, New Perspectives, and there's another one. Oh yeah, Another View of Stalin by Ludo Martin, and History and Critique of a Black Legend. I can go ahead and type these out. These are more or less the books. If you want page numbers, I'd have to go sifting, but damn it, no. So, Years of Hunger. I'd have to compile the sources, but Origins, Great Purge, Stalinist Terror, New Perspectives, both of which are by Getty. And let's see, Robert Thurston, I believe it's Road to Terror, but I don't quite remember. And another View of Stalin, and then History and Critique of a Black Legend. And there we go. So I'm just naming books. You can see them in the chat. So yeah, people downplay the degree to which the masses consented and participated in the project. The terror that transpired under Stalin wasn't just solely because of his government, but because of a revolutionary population that was engaged in the pioneering spirit. Another good book is Behind the Earls. This is another good one. This is a first-hand account by someone who lived in the Soviet Union in the 1930s while they were super industrializing. And he goes on to describe the attitude of the people there about very much being completely in line and on board with it for the most part. Like, for example, there were these farmers, these peasants that basically moved into the cities, and and one of his coworkers said that, the government basically expropriated their land and had it collectivized. And in the process of that, he had like a relative who tried to fight against he was trying to fight against it and basically trying to protest and fight against it. And long story short, he ended up getting shot. Well, it's very interesting because this guy goes on to say, this relative of his died, and they're going through all this turmoil right now, but in the minds of all, like in their minds, their mindset was very much, but look what we're building a better future, which we're all going to enjoy and profit off of, basically. They were pioneers. Like, the Russian people at the time were pioneers. They had a pioneering spirit that they were going to build a new society free of class and exploitation, that they were going to build a society that, a model society that, has never been seen before. They were undertaking a project the likes of which has never been done, at least on that scale. Like, you have the Paris Commune and you have little proto-socialist projects here and there, but we're talking about the Paris Commune, and then building socialism in a geographical region constituting 15% of the planet's total landmass, which eventually went on to constitute 30% of the human population. So anywho, Stalin. Yeah, so in that regards, I don't like the whole great man history, great man thinking that a lot of people engage in regards to Soviet history. On one hand, I acknowledge Stalin's achievements and the important contributions that he made to theory and the important role that he served as leader of the country. But on the other hand, I also acknowledge that, you know, he made a lot of key policy errors, and that there's definitely things he did that were totally unnecessary, excessive, and straight up didn't need to happen. So I guess, yeah, I have some criticism. So yeah, in regards to what he said about the deportations, that's a big one. The entire concept of the terror, like, if you're that paranoid that all the opposition are engaged in these conspiracies, even if some of them are guilty, some of them are not. Like, I don't think having them all shot and then having their family members shot is really necessary, because I mean, you could just have them all banished. Like, once you've kicked them all out of the country and you've just, you know, jailed or executed like the head honchos behind it that were orchestrating it, and you just either kick everyone else out of power or kick them out of the country, they can't do anything anymore. Like, they're no longer a threat. Like, there are people who have had like with Tukhachevsky, he ends up getting shot, and then they end up killing like half of the men on his side of the family, like on his family tree. They end up shooting like most of the men and jailing most of the women. Like, a lot of these people ended up in jail, then a lot of them ended up shot. Like, Baden Panada definitely has a point that a lot of people died needlessly, and I think that's a valid criticism. So, anywho, I got other ones as well. Lysenkoism, the what are some other ones? Personality cult, and what else? It's some stuff I'd have to reflect on. He wasn't a very good feminist. He continued the maltreatment of LGBT folk, which the entire planet was homophobic at the time, but as communists, we should be ahead of the curve when it comes to that sort of thing. So I don't make any excuses for that. That's fucking bullshit. So yeah, these are all fair and valid criticisms. And otherwise, yeah, I think that's about all I have to say. I mean, yeah, Yeltsin should have been shot. Definitely. At this point, I'm just running my mouth. I'm actually kind of running over, but I do plan on compiling this into a video. I'll leave it up for another day or two for your guys' enjoyment, but I am going to be uploading some videos soon using segments from this, so I'm going to go ahead and kill the stream. So y'all have a nice day. Take it easy, and peace.